The call came at 2047 in the morning, and I knew before I even looked at the screen. When you're a father, you just know. 34 years of knowing my daughter's voice in every possible version of it, laughing, arguing, singing off key in the kitchen, and I knew from the vibration alone that something was wrong. My hand found the phone in the dark before I was fully awake. Dad. Her voice was barely there, a whisper pulled thin like wire about to snap. Dad, I need you. Miriam. I sat up. Where are you? The parking garage, level 2. I can't, Dad, I can't drive. I can't stop shaking. A pause and then something that gutted me completely. She said it to my face. She said our baby would ruin everything they'd built. I was already out of bed, finding my keys on the hook by the door, not even remembering to turn on a light. Don't move. I'm coming. She was sitting on the concrete floor next to her car when I found her, back against the driver's side door, knees pulled to her chest. My daughter, 31 years old, a woman who ran half marathons and argued appellate procedure with people twice her age, sitting on a filthy parking garage floor at 3 in the morning like something in her had simply stopped working. I dropped down beside her without a word and put my arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into me and cried in a way she hadn't since her mother died. It took a long time before she could talk. Her husband was Elliot Hargrove. His family was old money from the Virginia horse country, the kind of old money that has a gate at the end of the driveway and a name on a building at the university. I'd met his mother, Constance, at the engagement dinner 3 years ago. She'd been gracious in the way that certain women are gracious, meaning every pleasantry was a small and perfectly wrapped gift that contained nothing. She'd called me a craftsman when someone mentioned I'd spent 30 years as a civil engineer. She'd asked Miriam twice how she pronounced her last name. Miriam's last name was Okafor, her mother's name, Nigerian, from a family that had been in this country for 40 years and built something extraordinary in those 40 years. Miriam had kept it after the wedding. Elliot hadn't minded, or said he hadn't. Constance had minded, we just hadn't known how much. She asked me to meet her for dinner, Miriam said finally, her voice steadier but hollow. Said she wanted to talk about the nursery, about what help she could offer. I thought she stopped, swallowed. I thought she was finally coming around. They'd had dinner at a restaurant Constance chose, somewhere with white tablecloths and a wine list longer than most novels. And halfway through the meal, Constance had set down her fork with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this and told my daughter that the pregnancy was a problem. Not those exact words. Women like Constance never use exact words when they can use beautiful, evasive, devastating ones instead. She'd talked about legacy, about what the Hargrove name had meant for 5 generations, about how she understood that the world was changing, of course it was, but some things needed to be preserved. She talked about Elliot's future in the firm his grandfather had started and how certain clients, certain families, had certain expectations. She'd said that a child, a mixed-race child, would complicate things, create friction, make Elliot's path unnecessarily difficult. And then she'd said the part that broke my daughter open. I've tried to support this marriage, Miriam. I have. But I have to be honest with you now. This child will not be what our family is, what our family has always been. Some lines are not meant to cross. Miriam had stood up, left $300 on the table, and walked to her car where she sat for 90 minutes before she could call me. I got her home to our house, the house where she'd grown up, where her mother had cooked jollof rice on Sundays and I'd fixed everything that broke and some things that didn't need fixing. I made tea. I knew neither of us would drink, and I sat across the kitchen table from my daughter and I listened to every word. And while I listened, something in my chest went very quiet and very cold. I'd felt that before, once. When Miriam's mother was in the hospital the last time and the doctor came in and I understood from his expression before he said a single word what he was about to say. That specific kind of cold, the kind that doesn't make you shake, the kind that makes you think with terrible clarity. I told Miriam to sleep. I told her we'd figure it out together, which was true, and I told her not to worry, which was a lie, because I was already working through what to do next. I want to be clear about something. I'm 63 years old. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, to a man who worked a steel mill and a woman who worked harder. I spent 30 years designing infrastructure, bridges, water systems, public works for a county that paid me what it paid me and thanked me the way governments thank the people who keep their systems running, which is to say almost never. I am not a dramatic man. I don't believe in revenge as a concept. I believe in accountability, which is different. Revenge is about making yourself feel better. Accountability is about making sure the damage stops. The damage, in this case, needed to stop. 2 days after Miriam's dinner with Constance, Elliot called me. He wanted to meet for coffee, said he'd heard about what happened and he was handling it. I agreed to meet him, and I sat across from my son-in-law at a diner off Route 29 and watched him explain that his mother sometimes went too far but meant well, that she came from a different era, that Miriam needed to understand the pressures he was under. I asked him one question. Do you want this baby? He looked at the table for a moment too long before he said yes, and something about that pause settled into me like a stone into still water. I drove back home and I started making calls. Elliot worked at Hargrove & Associates, the firm that had been in his family since his grandfather's generation. What most people didn't know, what I didn't know until I started asking around, was that the firm had been struggling. A development deal in Northern Virginia had gone sideways. 3 significant clients had moved their business elsewhere in the past 18 months, and the senior partners were quietly looking for outside capital investment. Elliot had been brought in as a rainmaker. His job was relationships. His job was to bring in money. I knew this because my old colleague, a man I'd worked alongside for 20 years who now consulted for commercial real estate firms, knew people who knew people. That's what 30 years of public sector work gives you. Not money, not prestige. A network of people who've been in the room when things happen. I also knew that Constance Hargrove had a philanthropic foundation attached to the family name. She chaired a charitable organization that gave grants to arts programs in the region. She sat on the boards of 2 private schools and 1 hospital advisory committee. Her reputation was a structure she'd spent decades building, and like any structure, it had load-bearing points. I want to be clear, I didn't do anything illegal. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't fabricate anything. I just made sure that the truth existed in more places than it previously had. First, I talked to Miriam. Told her what I thought we should do and why. She was quiet for a long time. You think it'll work? She asked. I think Constance has spent a lifetime treating people like obstacles to her preferences and walking away clean, I said. I think that's over now. What happens after is up to them. Miriam thought about it for another day. Then she called me back and said, let's do it. She had kept, without fully realizing she was keeping it, a record. Text messages from Constance going back 2 years. Emails in which Constance had referenced Miriam's background and her people. A voicemail, one voicemail, saved almost by accident, in which Constance had told Elliot that he needed to correct course before the situation became permanent. The restaurant where they'd had dinner had a decent reservation system, and Miriam had paid with a card, so we had date and time. And the things Constance had said to her face across that white tablecloth, Miriam wrote them down that night in notes on her phone, time-stamped, verbatim, while they were still fresh. Constance's foundation had a new grant cycle opening. They were soliciting applications from community arts organizations, and one of the requirements was a statement of the foundation's commitment to diversity and inclusion. It was right there on their website under Our Values. I have a friend, a former colleague, actually, someone I'd worked with on a county infrastructure project 15 years ago, who now teaches journalism at a state university. She also writes occasionally for a regional magazine that covers Virginia politics and culture, not a tabloid, a legitimate publication that serious people read. I called her. I told her I had a story, and I told her why I was telling it. She listened, asked careful questions, and said she'd need to verify everything independently before she'd consider publishing anything. I said, of course. I sent her everything Miriam had given permission to share. She spent 3 weeks verifying. She talked to 2 other women, one a former employee of the Hargrove firm, one a woman who'd been in Elliot's circle years before Miriam, who had their own experiences with Constance's particular brand of family values. Both women agreed to go on record. Both had their own documentation. The piece ran on a Thursday morning. It was careful and specific and devastating. It quoted directly from materials that had been provided and verified. It named names. It described the dinner. It quoted the voicemail. It placed Constance's private beliefs alongside her public statements about equity and opportunity from the Foundation's website. The contrast was not subtle. By Thursday afternoon, the article had been shared several thousand times. By Friday morning, 2 of the private school boards had contacted the Foundation requesting an emergency call. By Friday afternoon, the Hospital Advisory Committee had issued a statement that one of their members was taking a leave of absence pending review of recent public reporting. The Foundation's social media pages were temporarily taken offline. Elliot called Miriam on Friday, then called me. I didn't answer. He showed up at my door on Saturday. I opened it and looked at him, and I thought about that pause when I'd asked him if he wanted the baby. I thought about it for a moment. Then I invited him in. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat with Miriam while she was still shaking, and he talked for about 15 minutes. About his mother, about the pressure, about how he hadn't known what she was going to say that night at the restaurant, about how none of this was what he wanted. I let him finish. "Are you done?" I asked. He nodded. "There are 2 things that need to happen," I said. "The first is that you and Miriam need to decide if your marriage is something you actually want, not your mother's version of it, yours. If the answer is yes, then you need to demonstrate that clearly and consistently, starting immediately. If the answer is no, then the kindest thing you can do for my daughter is say so now, before the baby comes." He stared at the table. "The second thing," I said, "is that your mother never contacts Miriam again. Not directly, not through you, not through anyone. Whatever Constance needs to say to Miriam, she says to a lawyer. That's not negotiable." "My mother," he started. "I know what your mother is dealing with," I said. I didn't elaborate. He didn't ask how I knew. What Constance was dealing with, the Foundation's largest donor, a tech entrepreneur who'd given generously to the grants program for 4 years, had quietly pulled his commitment within 48 hours of the article running. The 2 private schools had not moved to remove her from their boards yet, but the conversations were ongoing, and there was. I learned through the same friend of a friend network some internal discussion at the firm about the reputational risk to Hargrove and Associates, and whether Elliot's position was sustainable given the circumstances. I hadn't caused any of this. I'd simply made sure the information existed in the world. What people did with it was their business. Constance did not reach out to Miriam again. Not that week, not ever. What happened inside whatever conversations she and Elliot had in private, I don't know. I don't need to know. What I know is what happened next. Elliot went to couples counseling with Miriam. He asked her to go, which I noted. He didn't wait for her to ask. He found a therapist on his own, a black woman in her 50s who specialized in interracial couples and family systems, and he made the appointment and told Miriam where and when, and said he'd be there if she wanted to come. She went. She told me afterward it was the first time he'd ever done something that hard without being guided toward it. They're still working. I don't say it's fixed because I don't know if it is. What I know is that my son-in-law is doing something I wasn't sure he was capable of doing, which is choosing something for himself instead of being arranged around his mother's preferences. The Foundation restructured. Constance stepped down from the chair position, voluntarily, the press release said, and the board brought in an interim director with an actual background in equity work. Whether the organization becomes what it claimed to be is not something I'll hold my breath on, but Constance Hargrove no longer runs it. My granddaughter was born on a Tuesday in March, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. a full head of dark hair, and eyes that couldn't decide yet what color they wanted to be. Miriam named her a Daisy, which was her mother's name, and Rose, which was my mother's name, and the combination of those two names felt to me like the most precise possible answer to everything Constance had said at that dinner table. I drove to the hospital that Tuesday morning before most people were awake. I sat in that room and held that baby while Miriam slept, and I thought about her grandmother, Miriam's mother, my wife, who had died 5 years earlier and never got to see this. I thought about what she would have said, how she would have laughed, how she would have started planning the child's entire future from the first hour. I thought about the two names pressed together into one, like a bridge between two families who had both worked hard and loved hard and were still here. Constance Hargrove never met her. Not then, not since. Whether she ever will is a decision that belongs entirely to Miriam, and Miriam hasn't made it yet, and that is exactly as it should be. I'm 63 years old. I built things my whole career, systems meant to last, infrastructure meant to hold weight. I understand load and stress and what happens when a structure is compromised and no one addresses it. I also understand that sometimes the most important structure you build is the one you construct around the people you love so that what's trying to break them can't get through. My daughter's doing well. She's on leave from her job, which she loves, and she'll go back to it, because she's the kind of person who always goes back to the things she loves. Daisy is 3 months old now, and has recently discovered that her hands belong to her, which strikes her as the most remarkable development in the history of the world, and watching her work through that discovery is the best part of my day. I built a rocking chair last month. Took me 2 weekends in the garage, which is longer than it should have taken me, but I'm not as fast as I used to be, and I've made my peace with that. It's a good chair, solid, the kind of thing built to last past the person who built it. Miriam cried when I brought it over, the good kind of crying. Some people look at what I did and think I went looking for a fight. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for a way to make sure my daughter and my granddaughter would be safe in their own lives, that the person who had decided they were problems would understand there were real consequences to that decision. There's a difference between picking a fight and refusing to walk away from one. I think about what would have happened if I'd done nothing. If I'd told Miriam that Constance was just difficult, that they should give it time, that things would smooth over. Maybe they would have, or maybe Constance would have spent the next 20 years making quiet, persistent, devastating choices from the position of a grandmother who was simply concerned. And my daughter and granddaughter would have absorbed those choices, like water damage absorbed by a foundation, invisible until it's structural. I wasn't willing to find out. The night Daisy was born, after Miriam was asleep and the nurses had dimmed the lights, I sat by the window with that baby and watched the parking lot lights below and thought about what this child would be told about who she is. She'll be told her great-grandmother came from Enugu and crossed an ocean because she believed in something better. She'll be told her other great-grandmother was from Ohio and worked her whole life without ever once thinking she deserved more credit than she got. She'll be told that both of those women shaped the people who shaped her and that she comes from people who didn't quit. She'll be told the truth about what happened when she's old enough, not to frighten her, not to make her carry anger that doesn't belong to her, but so she understands that her existence was not an accident and not a compromise. It was chosen, fought for, celebrated by the people who mattered. Constance Hargrove wanted to protect something. I understand that impulse, even if everything she did with it was wrong. The problem is, what she was trying to protect never existed. Some pure, unbroken line of something that is always, if you look closely enough, a story people tell themselves to avoid reckoning with how tangled and mixed and human we all actually are. My granddaughter's name is a Daisy Rose. She doesn't know yet what it means to carry two names from two worlds, but she will. And she'll know it as a gift, not a complication. She'll know it as exactly what she is, everything that matters, held together. I keep coming back to one moment. Not the article running, not the phone calls, not watching Constance's foundation go quiet online. I keep coming back to Elliot sitting at my kitchen table, looking at the wood grain and that pause before he said yes when I asked if he wanted his baby. That half second told me everything I needed to know about how we'd gotten here. Constance didn't build what she built overnight. She built it the way rot builds, slowly, in places no one thinks to look, fed by silence and accommodation. And the accommodation wasn't just Elliot's. It was everyone around her who found it easier to look away than to say, "This is wrong, and I won't pretend otherwise." That's how prejudice survives in families that consider themselves respectable. Not through dramatic confrontation, through 100 small choices to let it pass. What I learned from all of this is that character, real character, the kind that holds under pressure, isn't something you perform for people who are watching. It's what you do in private, in the small moments when the cost of doing right is real. Elliot failed that test for 3 years. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who kept choosing the easier thing, and the easier thing accumulated into something monstrous. I had to be honest with myself about that, because it would have been simpler to cast him as a villain and be done with it. He wasn't. He was someone who needed to decide what kind of person he was going to be and who, credit where it's due, eventually decided. My daughter had to make her own version of that decision, staying or leaving, trusting or not, letting a Daisy have a father or protecting her from one. Miriam made those choices with her eyes open, not because someone told her what to do, but because she thought it through and acted on what she actually believed. That's what I was most proud of. Not that she survived what happened, that she thought clearly while surviving it. As for me, I used what I had. 30 years of relationships, the ability to understand how systems work and where they're vulnerable, the patience to verify before acting. I didn't operate on anger, even when anger was completely justified. I operated on information, and I made sure that information existed in places where it could do what it needed to do. That's not righteousness. That's just being methodical about something that matters. What I want Daisy to understand, when she's old enough to hear this, the world will present her with moments where the right thing and the easy thing are not the same thing, and the gap between them will sometimes feel enormous. What you do in that gap is who you are. Constance chose comfort and control and a story she'd told herself so long she stopped questioning it. And that choice cost her everything she claimed to be protecting. Miriam chose honesty and courage and the harder path, and she built something real. That rocking chair is still in Miriam's living room. I can picture a Daisy in it 15 years from now. And I hope by then she knows, in the way you know things that come from watching the people who love you, that she comes from people who didn't let hard things make them smaller. That's the only inheritance that lasts.